Good afternoon, everyone. I like how Raz always calls me young. Let me add my welcome to Raz's and also my thanks to all those involved with this, especially Mickey, you, and Lee Johnson. This definitely was thanks to their hard work. And I also just want to get right into it with my panel, so let me thank them for agreeing to participate. These are three really outstanding scholars and outstanding speakers, so I think you'll enjoy them. Unfortunately, they're all three really have a terrible sense of humor, so you'll have to be warned about that. Yeah, so I'll just say, to add on to what Raz was saying, is why do we do these events? We've been doing them for about 5 years. It's interesting, but that's good. That's not really why we do it. We like to hear ourselves talk, but that's not really why we do it either. We're really interested in solutions, and when we're thinking about solutions, it's often the things you're not thinking about that are going to make or break whether solutions actually work. So there might be something you're a little bit excited about, but then you realize that it has all of these external benefits to other areas that you haven't been thinking about that really make it that much more exciting. Or obviously it could go the other way. There's something that you think is super exciting, and then you realize it has all of these reasons why it won't work because of other constraints, or a reason why if it did work, it would have all sorts of negative effects. And so forcing ourselves together now and then is great in terms of generating ideas about what solutions are most likely to work. And so I'm going to try to push this panel in that direction as we get into the discussion. Now, my panel insisted on being introduced like a basketball team, so I'm gonna call them up one at a time here. Our first is Marshall Burke. Marshall is a recent addition to our faculty here. We're all very excited to have him. He did his PhD at UC Berkeley in agricultural economics. And what else do you want me to say? He's pretty young, so he doesn't have that long introduction that eats into his time to speak, so he'll get more time to speak. Here you go. Come on up, Marshall. I think, yeah, it'll work best if we're all up here. So our next speaker after Marshall is going to be Steve Luby. Steve is professor of medicine here at Stanford, but he also has several other titles. He's a senior fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute, a senior fellow in the Woods Institute, and he's director of, I'm sorry here, so I've got it written down so I wouldn't forget, but I'm terrible at reading notes. So what is he? He is, I just want to get it right. So he's director of the Stanford Center for Innovation in Global Health. Steve spent much of his career working in both Pakistan and Bangladesh, has a ton of experience on both health and food issues in these countries and in the region of the world. And we're very excited that he also joined Stanford fairly recently. So I'll welcome Steve up to the stage. I should have said, so Marshall, I think, is our point guard, and Steve would be our maybe shooting guard. Then our big power forward down there is Scott Rozelle. Scott is a long-standing expert on agricultural economics. He got his PhD at Cornell. He taught at Stanford. He taught at UC Davis for a long time. And he really is, it's not an exaggeration to say, the world expert on food security in China, both agriculture, but also other dimensions of food security that he's increasingly gotten into. And we're very happy that he's both a senior fellow within our center at FSC. He's the director of the Rural Education Action Program. I think that's right. And a senior fellow at FSI. So Scott, please come up to the stage. So the way this will work is that we are going to have each speak for about 15 minutes. If there is something that you really can't wait to ask in terms of clarifying something, maybe as we transition speakers, you can get them to call on you. But really try to hold your questions for the panel discussion, and we'll have about half an hour for that if all goes according to time. I made sure they all drank a lot of water before this panel, so nobody's going to take too long to speak. And with that, we're just going to go in order. I'm not going to come up here to reintroduce everyone. So Marshall, then Steve, and then Scott. So we'll start with Marshall here.
Thanks. See if that does it there.
Yep.
Oh, well, that's coming up. All right. Well, thanks, David, for the introduction. It is nice to be junior faculty. Your introduction doesn't take more than about 5 seconds, so not wasting your time with that. It's great to be here. This seems like a great event, and it's nice to be at Stanford as junior faculty. So my job today is to connect the dots between food and conflict. And I think most people in the room today probably have some intuitive feel that these two things are connected, that there is some relationship between the food system and conflict, defined sort of broadly. But what I want to do today is to convince you and to show you new research findings that suggest that that relationship is actually much stronger than we previously thought. And so this is a topic I've worked on a lot with some co-authors over the last couple years, and I think we have some findings that speak to this relationship and that come through rather starkly. But to start things off, these are the sorts of images we're sort of flooded with all the time if we're watching the news. And images that do give us this sort of intuitive connection between the food system on the one hand and conflict on the other. So unfortunately, this image is quite recent. It is an image of women. They're on the Nigerian-Cameroon border. So these are women in a refugee camp run by the UN who have recently fled the Boko Haram violence in northern Nigeria. And they're all holding sacks. And the reason they're holding sacks is they've fled their farms. They're no longer able to produce their own food. Now they're in this refugee camp, and they're waiting for the World Food Program to, in this case, hand out high-protein biscuits, right? So this is clearly a food insecure situation, right? These women and their families are no longer able to produce food. They're not able to buy it. They're stuck in this camp. And it's clearly related to a conflict that was going on, right? The ongoing sort of very terrible violence with Boko Haram. Okay, so clearly lots of visual imagery that suggests this relationship is there. And a quick dip into the data will also suggest this. So here's data I pulled from the World Bank. On the x-axis here, the horizontal axis, is the number of years in conflict. So each dot here, sorry, is a country in the world. So the x-axis is the number of years this country has experienced conflict since 1980. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, is the percent of children who are undernourished. And undernourishment here is defined as being sort of 2 standard deviations shorter for your age than you should be. So I'm pretty short for my age, as David pointed out. But 2 standard deviations is really short for your age, right? So these are undernourished children. And as you can see there, and the sort of red line is the fit, this sort of simple fit to these relationship between these two variables. And it's upward sloping. And you can kind of see that if you squint your eyes, right? Countries that have had more conflict in the last 3 decades are often have much more child undernourishment. And especially if you look way out to sort of the upper right quadrant there, this is countries like Sudan, Somalia, Afghanistan, who have really, really high rates, some of the highest rates in the world of child undernourishment. Okay, so a simple relationship there, both in imagery and in the data. But what we want to know, right, is which way is the causal arrow going here, right? Is it the case that the arrow is going from food to conflict? So is the reason that these countries are so conflict prone because of something that's going on in the food system? Or is it the other way, right? Are they food insecure? Are they having trouble securing access to food and feeding their children because conflicts are going on? Or is it something in between, right? Is it some sort of interaction, a nexus, if you will, between food and conflict? And why does this even matter, right? So why are we even asking this question? Well, it could matter for multiple reasons. So imagine it's the sort of second example, right? So let's say conflict is one of the most important drivers of food security. Let's say that were true. So if that's true, and you're someone interested in promoting food security, then this would mean that policies sort of outside the sector you're normally interested in, which is often agriculture, might be the policies that really matter for the outcome that you care about, right? So this connection could really matter. Vice versa, if you're someone interested in conflict, and lots of people who don't care much about food security are very interested in conflict, if the arrow goes that way, if it goes from food to conflict, then this might argue for some policies that aren't typically thought about in the sort of security debate, right? Okay, so that's sort of why it matters. How can we sort of figure out the causality here is then the main research question. So this is what we spend a lot of time on. So just to take you through the sort of basic research design here, imagine the following, right? Take 2 countries in the world. They both start with N, so that's convenient. Norway and Nigeria, okay? So what do we know about these countries? Norway, we know, is food secure. If I go to Norway, I'm far and away the shortest person there. So these people are very well fed. It's also very peaceful, at least for the last couple hundred years, right? There were some problems with the Vikings, but that's been cleared up as best I understand. So, you know, the last 3 decades or so, Norway has not had any civil conflict. All right, compare that to Nigeria, right? So near Nigeria, we just saw an image from there. On the whole, they're fairly food insecure, one of the more food insecure places in the world. And they're also very conflict prone, especially recently, right? Okay, so what did we conclude from this, right? So we got Norway, food secure, peaceful. Nigeria, food insecure, conflict prone. Do we conclude then that food insecurity is what causes conflict? Okay, no. And I see some smiles or some smirks. Clearly, we don't want to draw that conclusion just from these data alone, right? For 2 reasons. One is the sort of reverse causality reason I already mentioned. The arrow could be running the other way. The second is what in the biz is called omitted variables, right? And what that means is Nigeria and Norway differ along so many dimensions, right? They differ both in their food security, in their peacefulness, but also in many other things, right? They have different neighbors, they have different institutions, and all of these things could affect both food security and conflict in ways that are hard to observe, right? So just sort of comparing these 2 countries like that might not tell us really what we want to know about these relationships. Okay, so what's a better research design? So instead of comparing Norway to Nigeria, we might think of comparing Nigeria to itself over time, right? So use Nigeria as both sort of the test case and the control case. So compare Nigeria to itself over time, or Norway to itself over time. And then what we want to do is look for what we call natural experiments, right? So Steve and Scott are, I think, going to tell you about some real experiments. So these guys can run randomized control trials where you actually vary sort of the treatment of interest and study how it affects the outcome. In this setting, we don't really want to run RCTs, right? And it's hard to run RCTs, and we definitely don't want to be out, you know, starting conflicts randomly and seeing what happens, right? That's a bad idea. So what we do then is look for natural experiments. So look for instances in which nature or some sort of abrupt policy change has shifted around one of these variables, either food insecurity or conflict, and we can use that variation to study sort of what happens to the other variable. So a natural experiment. Okay. So I'm going to take you through a few different natural experiments, sort of looking at both directions of the arrow here. So let's start with the first one, so conflict of food insecurity. This is sort of what I'm motivated with by the picture, and you can still see it sort of grayed out there in the back. So we can think of many reasons why conflict might be bad for food security. And so Roz sort of introduced what food security was nicely, and we can think of conflict as sort of negatively affecting the 3 or 4 main components of food security, right? So in the case of Nigeria, clearly it's inhibiting food production and trade, right? It's shutting down some of these markets. These people are having to flee their farms. It's also easy to see in these conflicts that they can destroy productive assets, right? These productive assets can be looted or totally destroyed. It can also worsen access to health facilities, right? So it can destroy health clinics or make it harder for people to get to them. So even if you have food, you might be so unhealthy for some other reason that you might not be able to take advantage of the nutrients, right? Okay, so many sort of plausible reasons why these things might be related. What's some evidence on this? Here's one piece of evidence, and there's actually a sort of growing evidence on this now. This is evidence from the Rwandan Civil War, all right? And again, on the y-axis is sort of what we had before. It's sort of a summary measure of undernourishment. It's how tall your kids are relative to sort of how tall they should be, the sort of average world child at a given age. And what these guys can do in this paper, this is not my own work, this is Richard Akresh and co-authors. It turns out that this war it started in 1991, the genocide was a few years later. It affected part of Rwanda really heavily and the other part not so much. So what you can do is sort of look at what was happening beforehand. So that's their data starting about 1987, and you can run that forward. The war started in sort of late 1990. And the 2 different lines show the heights of children in the areas that are going to be affected by the war and the areas that aren't going to be affected by the war. So before the war, they look pretty similar. Again, these children are, Rwanda is very poor, and these children start out sort of the baseline malnourishment is really bad. So these guys are more than 2 standard deviations on average lower than the reference child, so they're really bad to start with. But it's sort of trending up, right? But then look what happens when the Civil War starts, right? The kids in the war-affected areas, so these are kids now who are being born right around when the war starts or right afterwards. They're more than a standard deviation shorter than the kids in the unaffected regions, right? So in this case, this war happens, it affects part of the country, and it has huge fingerprint here on child nutrition, right? Very big effects. Okay, so economists were like, yeah, sure. war kills people, it maybe makes your kids sick, but what does it do to the economy, right? What is it? This is how economists make themselves unpopular. But what you can see then is it's also not good for the broader economy. So here are 4 countries who have had large civil wars in the last 20 or 30 years. So Burundi, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Sierra Leone. Sorry, it's a little bit fuzzy. And the gray areas are the time period when that civil war happened, right? And what the lines show you here then is what was happening to per capita GDPs over time. And in each instance, you have this very sort of characteristic signal, right? They're sort of going up slowly over time. The dotted line gives you the trend, sort of what would have happened if they just continued up. And the dark solid line tells you what happens, right? And so sort of right when the Civil War starts, per capita GDPs totally tank and don't really recover, at least over the time periods we look here. Okay, so conflict can clearly be bad for sort of food insecurity, and it can clearly have sort of broader economic effects. But maybe this is good news in a way, right? I don't know if you guys have read this very nice book by Steven Pinker. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature, subtitled Why Violence Has Declined. So what he does is put together this long sweeping view of history and lots of data to show that violence has actually declined substantially over human history, and suggests that the era in which we're living right now is actually the most peaceful time humans have ever experienced, right? So if that's true, then this might actually be good news for food security, right? If sort of conflict's going down over time and is going to keep going down, then maybe these food security outcomes will continue to improve. Okay, so why might that not be the case? So if you actually look in the last couple decades, it's not obvious that conflict has actually gone down. So I'll show you two different pieces of evidence on this. So here are global civil wars and civil conflicts over time. So civil conflicts, the sort of technical definition, are years in which 25 people died in battle. It sounds like a Game of Thrones thing, but people are actually out there counting up battle deaths. So civil conflicts are 25 people died in battle. Civil wars are years in which 1,000 people died in battle. And you can see these were actually going up until the mid-90s and sort of peaked, and then they've come down a little bit, but not entirely, right? So at least to me, no clear evidence that these things have come down sort of dramatically. Similarly, with smaller scale measures of civil conflict, so this is a measure of civil unrest in sub-Saharan Africa. So sort of bumping along through about the mid-2000s, and then you get the Arab Spring, and these things totally take off, right? So this is things like government riots and also government violence against civilians, right? So again, not a lot of direct evidence that conflict has come down. And finally, it's not clear that conflict is the only factor, right? This sort of, in food security, it's an upward sloping relationship, but we have a lot of sort of unexplained variation, right? And I've highlighted this area up in the upper left, right? These are countries that haven't had much conflict in the last couple decades, but still have really high rates of child malnutrition, right? So conflict clearly matters for food insecurity, but it's not the only thing going on. Okay, so how about the other direction? Food insecurity causing conflict. Okay, again, economists like to make themselves unpopular. Here's the way they think about war, right? They think about it as just this very cool cost-benefit calculation, right? Cool in the sense of cool-headed, right? I'm a person, and I'm near one of these conflicts, and I'm just making a very calm calculation about weighing the costs and benefits of joining this conflict, right? And we might think that in a really bad year, a year in which you're really food insecure, the cost of joining a conflict might be lower, right? You can't work on your farm, maybe your productivity has been demolished, and so there's no cost of sort of leaving your farm and joining a conflict. And so this might sort of change the cost-benefit calculation. The view we might be more familiar with is more sort of intuitively familiar with is what we might call the grievance view. This is just, you're pissed off when things aren't well, right? And sort of put more formally, insecure access to food, you might view this as sort of a breach of the social contract. So this is sort of the argument you hear in the Arab Spring, where you see what looks like a lot of food riots as food prices were also spiking during this period, right? People viewed this as the government just unable to deliver them the sort of fundamental building blocks of their livelihoods, right, in terms of cheap food. Okay, so some evidence on that. This is the relationship between global food prices and, again, these riots that started happening and really started spiking in sort of the end of the last decade and this past decade. So these are, the black line here is sort of a measure of the global aggregate food price. It's a food price index. And then the red lines here are are different conflicts around the world. And the little numbers give you sort of, sorry, these are riots. And the little numbers are actually how many people died in the riots. And so what this suggests is that we see a lot of sort of spikes in riots right around when food prices were the highest, all right? But again, this is sort of correlational. So what we've done with the co-author is actually try to look at this causally, right? So we can use as our sort of external variable, the thing that's sort of outside our system moving things around is this global price index, right? So prices are set globally. They're not really affected too much by what's going on in Africa. And we can study what that does to conflict within Africa. And I'm just showing you here maps from data that we have suggesting sort of locations and timing of conflict in different parts of Africa. And what we find when we do that is that a 1 standard deviation increase in food prices leads to a 10% increase in these types of conflicts, right? So that's a pretty large effect. And the effect is twice as big if you isolate it to cities. And this is the place where you'd have sort of most of the poor consumers and the guys who would really be hurt by higher food prices, right? So a clear sort of link between, in this case, increased food insecurity due to high food prices and more civil conflict. Okay, one more in my last minute here. The last natural experiment we can think about is sort of the experiment that the weather gives us, right? So we know that the weather matters for agricultural productivity, right? And David's work has shown this. If you want to learn more about this, he has about 900 papers showing that in different parts of the world and for different crops, really hot years or really dry years are bad for agricultural productivity, right? But whether this year is hot or whether this year is normal is a little bit random, right? It moves around a little bit from year to year. And so we can use that variation as something that shifts around agricultural productivity and food security in a way that allows us to understand how that then affects civil conflict, right? So I won't go through in detail, but we had a paper that did this sort of around the world. It came out a few years ago now with co-authors Saul Shang and Ted Miguel at Berkeley. I'm showing you 3 examples here. And so what we've done is, in using different data sets, sort of at different spatial scales, studied the relationship between temperature, which here on the bottom plots is on the x-axis, and the change in conflict risk, which is on the y-axis. So no matter whether you look at sort of the tropics as a whole, that's the green panel, sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, so using sort of country-level data, or using really micro-level data in part of sub-Saharan Africa, so in this case, East Africa. What you see in each case is this strong upward-sloping relationship between hotter-than-average temperatures and pretty large increases in these different types of civil conflict. Okay? So again, the sort of take-home finding here is that a 1 standard deviation increase in temperature, and again, we know this is affecting agriculture, right? That leads to this sort of magical 10% number. We got sort of the same number in this study, a 10% increase in these conflict events, right? Okay, so to finish up here, the food conflict nexus. So clearly this is a nexus, right? The errors are going in both directions. My take-homes, I think so far are 2, although this is, again, a sort of rapidly evolving research area. The first is that conflict is definitely unimportant, but probably not the most important factor in food security. You know, clearly these things are related, but we still see a lot of countries that have not had conflicts, but who remained very food insecure. So it's important, but maybe not the most important. On the other hand, I think food security and sort of economic livelihoods more broadly, our research and related research would suggest these could be a really underappreciated driver of civil conflict, right? And so the sort of policy take-home there then is that investments in food security and improving agricultural productivity really could pay double here, right? They're going to improve food security, which is something we care about on its own, and they could have this added and maybe sort of unexpected benefit of reducing conflict as well. Thanks.
It's really terrific to be here. I'm grateful to the Tomcat Center and to the Food Security and the Environment that we have an opportunity to come together and talk about issues that I see as really crucial. As David mentioned, I joined Stanford recently. I've spent most of my career working and living in low-income countries. And the opening picture here is a picture from rural Bangladesh from when I was out earlier this year. And what you can see is there's water, so a resource that matters for growing. And you see these very green and beautiful rice fields. and you see some children walking along. And it might not be so clear from this picture, but these children, in fact, are pretty short. So I want to pick up on one of those themes that Marshall mentioned about how we as physicians think about malnutrition. So a normal child, given good nutrition, will grow normally, and we can measure how they grow. And by contrast, if children are not fed a good diet, they just don't grow as large. And so the term that we use is they're stunted, or they have low height for age. You'll also hear the term HAZ, or height for age Z-score. So when David Lobel was studying statistics, he spent a lot of time looking at normal curves. So this is a normal curve. So if we say a Z-score less than -2, that means that in a normally fed population, only 2.5% of the population would be at that tail end of the curve. So when we're talking about stunting, children that are stunted, it's children who are down in this lowest portion, 2 standard deviations, 2 Z-scores below the mean. So if we consider the prevalence of malnutrition in the world over the last 30 years, it's actually somewhat surprising. If I presented you data on child mortality, we've made a lot of progress on. Children are much more likely to survive now than they were 30 years ago. But child malnutrition, child stunting, has been remarkably stubborn. We've made some progress over 30 years, but we're still looking at 200 million children or so under the age of 5 years who meet the WHO criteria of being stunted, more than 2 standard deviations below the mean. And if you look, you can see most of those kids are in South Asia. They're in the red, or in the blue, sub-Saharan Africa. So I've spent a lot of time in South Asia, and some folks look at this and say, well, wait a minute. I've been following the Olympics, and I noticed that Bangladesh has never made it into the basketball finals. And so what makes you so sure this is all about nutrition? Can't this really be about genetics? Might some people just be shorter, genetically shorter? And so maybe we should have different standards for folks in South Asia as compared to folks in Norway or folks in Palo Alto. So the World Health Organization took this critique very seriously and conducted a multi-center growth reference study. They enrolled 8,440 children, but they were from affluent families. So they wanted people that were getting good nutrition in these various countries. So when they enrolled children from Brazil, from Ghana, from India, from Norway, from Oman, and from the US. And they took these babies and they measured them 21 times during their first 24 months to see how these children with this very varied genetic endowment grew. What did they find? What they found was that the length of the children was strikingly similar across the 6 sites. Indeed, only 3% of the variability amongst this was inter-site variability. I'm not saying that all these children grew at the same pace. What I'm saying is that the children in India were just as tall as the children in the US. So it doesn't look like this is primarily a genetic difference. So, but yet we do see differences. Muggsy Bogues is 5'3" tall. And he's not stunted. He's a short guy. But you can see he's really quite high performing. He's amongst the shortest people ever to play in the NBA. He was drafted 12th overall, and he played 14 seasons. During those 14 seasons, he blocked 39 shots, including, most memorably, a shot by Patrick Ewing, the 7'2" center of the New York Knicks. Now, by contrast, he's here guarding Sean Bradley. Sean Bradley is not short. Sean Bradley is among the tallest players ever in the NBA. He was drafted 2nd overall, so a little higher than Muggsy. He also played 14 seasons, and if you noticed, he blocked a lot more shots. So maybe we conclude tall people have more skills. There's something about height that's telling us about capacity. On the other hand, Muggsy had over 6,000 assists. 6,000 more assists than Sean Bradley. So what does this tell us? There's a lot of variability in height in a normal population. And just because Scott is taller than Marshall doesn't mean that Scott's going to publish more than Marshall during his career. This variability is normal variability, but we still worry about stunting. We worry about stunting. Health professionals worry about stunting because when entire communities are short, not individuals, but when entire communities are short, this is a marker of chronic undernutrition. Best estimates are that 1.4 million children die every year from disease that is attributable to this undernutrition. And as I've alluded to, it's not just the deaths, but children who survive but are malnourished also face a lot of difficulties. Just like they don't have enough nutrients to grow normally, they also don't have enough nutrients for their brains to develop normally. These malnourished children, as they grow up, earn decreased wages compared to those children that are not malnourished, and they face an increased burden of chronic disease. So if we think about when does this growth faltering occur, if you look at this over time, you can see along the x-axis, that's the z-score, and you can see in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, children already start off a little small. They are not starting at a z-score of 0, they're already down around 0.5. So they're being born small to begin with, but what's really most impressive is how quickly, over the course of 24 months, they just go down and down and down. This is the time when they're moving from exclusive breastfeeding and solid foods are being introduced. So this is now looked at as this first 1,000 days, including the 9 months in utero and the first 2 years, as a time of particular importance if we want to improve the problem of child malnutrition globally. This is a time when we need to think about maternal nutrition, early child nutrition, and has really been a key area for both research and interventions. So if children are malnourished, it seems like the most sensible thing to do would be to feed them more, right? Get Roz and the team to grow more food and give more food to the children. But it turns out that just feeding them more food, like Roz was suggesting, might just be empty calories. What they don't need is not just more calories, they need nutrient-dense food. So the nutritionists figured this out quite a while ago and said, okay, why don't we do interventions to give these children in low-income countries nutrient-dense food or supplements that provide these key nutrients? Well, what happens then? So you can give them, this is like NutriButter, which is a food that has peanut oil and some other micronutrients. If you supplement these children, you only correct about 1/3 of their growth faltering. So even then, you haven't taken care of this problem. So it becomes a pretty big question. If lack of food is not the sole common underlying sufficient cause of stunting, what else is driving this? Well, one thing that might be driving this is our small intestine. How many people here thought about their small intestine this morning? You know, the small intestine is kind of like the Rodney Dangerfield of organs. You know, it just really doesn't get a lot of respect. People don't think very much about their small intestine. But it turns out your small intestine is really important. You know, the food we eat is not sterile. It's got a lot of things in there that potentially could attack our system. But if you look at those of us who live in Palo Alto, we've got this really remarkable small intestine that has an enormous surface area that both has a lot of immune cells to separate out potential pathogens and yet very efficiently absorb nutrients. By contrast, in the places where I work, the environment is very contaminated. The food is very contaminated. The water, the very environment is very contaminated. And the small intestine is exposed to high levels of contamination. And in fact, if you look at the small intestine, it looks radically different. It is so filled with immune-activated cells, it actually has reduced the total surface area. So this is a condition called environmental enteric dysfunction and is an area of research that we're looking at to try to look at this contribution that this might make to child development and growth. And so then this has us saying, well, we were beginning by saying, how does this all connect the dots? It turns out that clean water is important, because if you don't get clean water, then your body already has to be fighting whatever may be germs in that water. But if we have clean water and we have nutrient-dense food, we're beginning to have the substrate for healthy growth. But I also want to mention another issue that Roz raised, and that is having energy. Energy can make an enormous difference. She gave the example in Benin of being able to improve irrigation with water. This is a picture of a solar panel from rural Bangladesh. One of the things that these solar panels can be used for is to run lights at night, which can also allow school children to study, which can help their cognitive development. So we can imagine if you do connect the dots between clean water, nutrient-dense food, and energy, that you can end up with healthy, thriving communities. But in fact, if we look at the communities where the poor live, that's not what these communities look like. In the city that I lived in for 8 years, 98% of our fecal sludge in Dhaka, Bangladesh, a city with a population of 14 million people, is discharged untreated in the environment. So that's a picture that shows open sewage, and that's a water line running right through the sewage line. So people are not living in a clean environment, and the poor who live here really have limited ability to secure clean food, to secure clean water, nutrient-dense food, or clean energy. So someone who's thought a little bit about what it's like to live in the setting where food is insecure is one of our great authors from the UK, George Orwell, in his somewhat autobiographical work on Down and Out in Paris and London. And quoting Orwell, he says, "Hunger reduces one to an utterly spineless, brainless condition, more like the after effects of influenza than anything else. It's as though one had been turned into a jellyfish, or as though all one's blood had been pumped out and lukewarm water substituted. Complete inertia is my chief memory of hunger." So it's actually hard when you're hungry to put forth your best effort. And in fact, what we find in the data is that impoverished households are risk averse. In Bangladesh, non-cereal crops, these are lentils. Lentils are great crops. They're good for the soil. They naturally fix nitrogen. They're high in protein. They provide better nutrition. And if you grow them, you actually generate more income per acre. But Bangladeshi farmers prefer to grow rice, and the lentils are, much of the lentils are imported. They're more familiar, and they know better what to expect with rice. If you talk to them, they say, look, taking risks on growing something new is something rich people do. We're too poor to take risks. So as we think about these dots, not only can clean water, nutrient-dense food, and clean energy lead to healthy, thriving communities, but it's actually healthy, thriving communities that can generate these same inputs. So I like to think of this as a cycle. Given that context, how do we think about issues going forward? Well, there's some reason for optimism. One of the things that has just been remarkable, and Roz mentioned the case of Indonesia and China, but this has really been a global phenomenon, has been economic improvement. And so that many groups, and this is a consensus graph, everybody from the Brookings Institute to the World Bank weighing in, looking on when will we end extreme poverty, that less than $1 a day, which was over 40% in the 90s and projected to be below 3% by 2030. So the economic growth in this country, the narrative of public health has always been, oh, but there are all these really poor people. There are huge disparities. With economic growth, there is a prospect for a changing narrative. Global deaths for children under 5 have followed this same trajectory, from nearly 18 million in 1970 down to fewer than 8 million more recently. So we have an opportunity within the coming decades to move from a focus on child survival really to child thriving, and to think about not just can we get to survival, but can we think about creating communities that support a healthy planetary biome to support thriving societies. But there are also risks looking forward. I would say the biggest risk is that we continue to demand more of the biome, and that is population growth. Best estimates of population is that we are going to hit on the order of 10 billion people by 2050. And this is simply more than we've ever asked the planet to produce for. Now, population growth rate is going down. In Bangladesh, in the 1970s, women on average had 7 children. It's now down at 2.2, 2.3, right near replacement. So the growth rate is going down, but the population of the world is so young, we have what demographers call population momentum. So we're going to go to 10 billion. And this makes enormous demands on resources. The aquifers in California are not the only aquifers that are being overdrawn. The same is true in northern and western India. We really risk non-sustainable pressure on global resources. I'm also worried about shocks. It's not just can we hustle, 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 and maybe make it to feed 10 billion people, but what happens when there's a shock, like a volcanic eruption? If we think about the volcanic eruption that occurred almost 200 years ago in 1816 in Indonesia, in Tambora, it released so much ash that in the summer of 1816 in New England, there was a deep freeze every single month. Across Massachusetts and upper New York State, there was 6 inches of snow that fell on June 6. Prices of hay went up 6 times. Prices of oats were 2 and 3 times up. And there was an enormous threat. So one of the ways that I look at this is saying not just how can we feed 10 billion, but what's going to happen is we're maxing everything out and we face a threat of volcanic eruption or a regional nuclear conflict, kind of forgetting for a minute nuclear fallout and just thinking about the ash generated by the incineration of cities would be expected to generate enough blockage to sunlight to markedly affect crop production. So what are we going to do? Well, one of the things I think that's really important is for us as researchers at Stanford to engage in these important issues. I think there is a real role for a university to appreciate the complexity of these nexes and to explore potential solutions. But I also think that we as individuals can make differences. One of the things that's kind of nice about there being a connection is that it means that the things that we do can have an impact on other aspects. So these are not data from radical environmentalists. These are data from the Food and Agricultural Organization looking at the impact of livestock. Raising livestock accounts for 30% of total human water use, 55% of erosion, and in the US, a third of our nitrogen and phosphorus, over a third of our pesticides, heavy metals, and over half of our antibiotic exposure. So one thing we might do is eat less beef. And that might not only help a little bit here, but then maybe we even start to change the demand about how land is used and which crops are grown. Thank you.
Thank you, organizers, and to the audience to come. Now, I'm going to tell you about food security in a very different environment where most people have z-scores of, HAZ scores of 0. They look very healthy from the outside. And I'm going to tell you how we're going to solve that problem is by eating more beef. And then think about the nexus of the tension that rises because of that. And mine is so radically different that I have to have a different PowerPoint clicker. I'm going to talk about food security, the world's second food security challenge, and that's in middle-income countries. And I think it's a set of questions that almost has never been talked about before. And I think the consequences is what is part of what is known as a middle-income trap, which when developing countries that hit middle income, $5,000 to $10,000, $12,000 per capita, and growth stagnates, some cases collapses, and this collapse creates conflict. This collapse pushes countries back into being poor, and can have perhaps even more dramatic consequences and spillovers in the certain countries I think about if perhaps when it happens in very large and powerful countries like China. There's many different theoretical sources of this and misdirected investments, interest groups. I think that one thing that plays a very big role here, possible role, and these we're really working on research now and foreshadowing what I'm going to be talking about today is the poor health and education that becomes systematic in these systems, and it's when populations are nutrient deficient that leads to poor health, poor education. It happens just as countries are demanding higher cognition and higher health, that then leads to sort of a stagnation in the transformation of economies that propel countries to go from middle to high income. Things stagnate, investment flees, then you get all sorts of possible collapses, high crime, unemployment, and you're caught in this trap. And there's lots and lots of dots to connect. So let me go. I'm going to do this to really look at the second food security challenge and some of its implications by first looking at the first food security challenge. And Roz made it easy. She sort of sketched the broad thing, but I want to put it in the same sort of ideas how I think about this. Then I'm going to look at the second food security challenge and look at the economic context of it. And some of the reasons. How is it in these in very fast-growing, increasingly rich countries like Brazil, like China, like Chile, like South Africa, is that we can have dramatic undernourishment, malnourishment, and that these can have economic, education, and truly conflict implications. So traditional food security, right? This is when countries go from poor to middle income. And to be honest, I spent my whole career here at Stanford and other places thinking about food security to go from poor to middle income. I studied China. When I started studying China, China is one of the poorest countries in the world. we're going to go over the phase 2 in a little bit, and it was very easy. We understood it. Food security, as Roz said, is having adequate food supplies of affordable food, calories and protein, having 0 height for age scores, that your normal weight, normal height for each household throughout the year to ensure a healthy and productive life. You can also say this at a nation's level. Each nation, everybody in the entire country has enough health and nutrition that you have natural growth from poor to middle income. The development link, of course, is that if you have insufficient calories, many of the countries that Marshall was looking at, you have very poor health, you have very increased morbidity, you have stunting, wasting, chronic diseases, you don't have enough energy to go plant crops, you don't have enough energy to go to the factories, and you get caught not in a middle income trap, in a poverty trap. Of course, the source of the problem for households, right, is exactly what Roz says. They don't have the income to buy that, and food prices are very high. And that's what really characterizes the conflict that we saw in the countries that Marshall was looking at. But when prices are low, when we have a lot of food, even with low levels of income in these very poor countries, like Indonesia that Roz was talking about, people are able to access food, they escape the malnutrition, when prices are low and incomes are rising, they're even more affordable. And so what we get is this upward spiraling curve that has propelled so many countries of the world from low to middle income, where you get increasing incomes from green revolution investments, the irrigation systems, the fertilizer systems that then leads to rising consumption, more production, falling prices, even more consumption. Now, it's not all agriculture. It's like all conflict isn't due to food prices. All of economic development isn't due to agriculture. If you get some good basic education, now kids get discipline, they know how to read and write. Then you get a good industrial and trade policy. You get industrialization, low-wage manufacturing started. You move people into the factories. They get more income, rising consumption again. Wages go up. There's a spiral. There's even more factory work. And suddenly countries have transformed themselves from these poor subsistence agriculture communities into these middle-income, vibrant countries that sometimes we're afraid of, sometimes we like to go visit, but it's these countries that are really dynamic and growing fast. The metric for success in food security terms is that they have enough calories, that they have enough protein, that they can work in those factories and construction sites. They've left the farm, they got bigger farms, they can work in those farms, and they can be strong and healthy. And the middle-income countries that we know about and visit, they've made it. Look at the number of calories the number of kcalories per day in Brazil, China, Mexico. It's more than enough, and that's why when you look at those nice curves that David Lobel looked at, there's most of the people in those countries are right around the middle. They're tall and not skinny, no distended bellies. Okay, so we shouldn't worry about them anymore, right? And the FAO basically moves them off the list of food insecure countries, and we don't worry about it anymore. I'm going to try to argue that this is a real problem, and the context is in these middle income countries. And what I want to do is try to really paint a picture of what's happening in there, so you can understand how malnutrition can really continue to coexist in these economies with very fast rising income. And there's a lot of dots to collect. It's very complicated. And it's trying to understand this dynamic to go from middle income to the rich country. We have to take everything we learn about food security and sort of push it away, because it has a very, very different dynamic. Who is in this? Well, it's, it's all these countries that are in these middle income levels. And it's countries besides income that share a lot of other characteristics. Wages are rising, right? I mean, now we've moved all the people off the farm. There's some people left farming, and now suddenly to build more factories, you got the wages start to get bid up. Urbanization happens. Low-wage manufacturing starts to go. We're doing a lot of work in China in the electronics industry, and every day Sony announces they're moving their operations to Vietnam. Samsung is closing down all low-wage manufacturing in China. Where is the iPhone 8 going to be built? All those low-wage jobs are leaving, and that's what happens in middle-income countries. They reindustrialize, going towards high innovation-based industries, high premiums on education, health. If the wage is high, you're going to need to know math, science, language, foreign language to get a job in these economies. Who was working, what kind of jobs were being done in South Korea during the 1990s when they moved from low-wage manufacturing to high fashion. They moved to chip making. They moved to taking managers and moving them to China to run the low-wage manufacturers in China. And all of these were those high-wage jobs. And every single person in South Korea basically got one of those jobs, and they moved seamlessly from middle income to high income. What about Mexico? Well, Mexico's a very different place than South Korea today. Mexico's a middle income country. It's a country that didn't give all of its population good health and good education. So what we see in Mexico today is, yes, we got high fashion, we got chip manufacturing, we have a lot of finance services, very good resource and trade going on there from part of the population. But the other part of Mexico, what are they doing? They're coming to the United States. They're working in the informal economy, completely without benefits, without a future. And of course, they're working in organized crime and cartels. Two very different ways to get through the middle income. And Mexico, of course, hasn't been through there yet. So all of this, of course, takes place in a country that's not fully developed, characterized by less than perfect economic and social institutions. And I think that this is absolutely key to understand what's going on. There's less than perfect credit markets in Brazil, China, Colombia, Chile, Mexico today. They have less than perfect health insurance, less than perfect Social Security, less than perfect welfare systems. There's a very low and permeable net. These countries just haven't had time to develop them. Plus, every single one of these countries have extremely high inequality. This is a Gini ratio that measures that level of inequality. The United States that we feel is so highly unequal, we're at 41. So these other countries have very high inequality. And so what happens? So even though per capita income is growing so fast, when you have these, you are in a country that has high inequality, you have 150 million people that still make $2 a day. They were making 50 cents a day 15 years ago, but still it's very, very poor. And without really good institutions out there, there's lots of risks, exactly the type of risks that Steve was talking about. And so what we're going to go find is that food security in this middle-income world is not macronutrient deficiencies. We've already seen that. It's hidden hunger. It's iron, zinc, vitamin B, more. And what I'm going to try to show is that it's a pervasive problem. Here's data from WHO that looks at some of the richest middle-income countries out there, and look at the rates of iron deficiency anemia among preschool kids. Right? These are the kids that Steve just told us, if your brains don't develop when you're the first 1,000 days, they're going to be permanently handicapped for one's whole life. 55% of preschool kids in Brazil are micronutrient deficient. Mexico, Thailand, China, 20%. And in our work that we've done in China, we have looked extensively at infants and school kids, and look at this. And we're working in very poor rural areas. We went out and tested 2,000 babies and their moms in southern Shanxi. This is like 2 hours outside of Xi'an, one of the fastest growing cities in China. And what we found was that over 40%, almost 45% of infants today in China are sick. I mean, that they're malnourished. They're iron deficient, they're zinc deficient, and many other nutrients. Then you give these 6-month-old babies an IQ test. Giving a 6-month-old baby an IQ test is really a lot of fun. It takes a long, long time. One enumerator does 2 tests per day. You get almost done with the test, and then the baby decides to take a poop or decides to take a nap, and then you have to almost start all over. And what we find is that 40% of these infants are failing their IQ test, and that there's this high correlation with malnutrition. We actually have now followed these same kids for 4 rounds. They're now 3 years old. 50% of them have failed their toddler IQ tests. 50% of half of China's population, that's 25%, they'll probably never have an IQ above 90, are basically mentally disabled. And there's all of these other lifetime effects of this problem. So what does this mean in harshest terms is that, China is in trouble. But this same role is being played out in all other middle-income countries. And so also in school-age kids, we've tested over 60,000 school-age kids in China. 33% of them are malnourished. Okay? In the poor rural West, where half of China's school-age population lives. There's 30 million school-age children in China that have anemia today. And of course, we know the same thing. Anemia affects school performance, attendance, health, behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is it true? I mean, is it really true that if we address this anemia, that education gets better? Well, here's not our natural experience. We actually did randomized controlled trials in the field and went to 60 schools in this Western China province. We tested for anemia. We gave them math tests. And then we flipped the coin and randomized those schools into 2 sets. One that we're going to treat, the black ones, one that we're not. They're going to start with the same HB levels, the same anemia rates, the same test scores. It's like having identical twins, right? And except one twin, we're going to give a treatment to get rid of their malnutrition, and the other we're not. And we're going to be able to see the causality of that. The treatment's very simple. 1 dime a day, and the teacher forces it down the kid's throat. I'm very much for these types of treatments. You can see they're not always so happy, and the control schools get 0. We then go give them another test 6-7 months later. We then test for anemia again, and what do we find? Up goes hemoglobin rates, down goes anemia, and up goes test scores. Just like that. I mean, and if you don't believe one trial, we did a second trial. We did a third trial. We did a fourth trial. Every single time, up goes hemoglobin, down goes anemia, up goes test scores. So we see that the answer is yes, this is affecting education. It's affecting the outcomes in cognition. And the implication of if anemia rates are high, students are underperforming. And so the summary of this is that hundreds of millions of children in these middle-income countries are cognitively impaired. They aren't competitive in local school systems. What do? They aren't learning. They drop out. Well, it doesn't matter in Brazil if there's high dropout rates from junior high. in the short run, they go work in their low-wage factories. But wages are rising, factories are leaving. Soon, you end up with a polarized labor force where half is in a high-wage sector, the rich get richer, half is in informal sector, they drop out altogether. In your country like China and Brazil, you can't run to the United States and work in the low-wage sector here. You either go to the informal sector or you join a gang or organized crime. And society then spends more and more on police, more and more on these unproductive assets. Investment falls. How much investment is going to Mexico today? Stanford doesn't let our students go to Mexico, undergrad students. Why would any businessman want to invest there? So I'm going to just finish here with an explanation for the causes. How could this happen? Countries are growing fast, wages are rising, there's lots of poor people, there's not extreme poverty. Why don't people, don't they love their babies and their kids? Well, number one, I think we're a victim of the Green Revolution. We've produced food, prices of food are low, we eat cheap calories, okay? It's just like the cheapest calories in the United States are Coca-Cola and potato chips. We eat a lot of them, especially poor people. They're poor people, and the poor part of the income distribution is there. Second, many reasons for not spending a more diverse diet. The real cost of meat and fruits is higher. Third, what do they do with all that extra income? Income's going up every day. Well, you know, it's very clear, I think now that we understand, because we don't have the institutions, health insurance, remember, the poor, Social Security, the credit markets, we have to save for everything. We have to save for marriage, save for housing, save for retirement, save for catastrophic illnesses. There's a veritable battle for the wallet. And so when families are saying, should I take my extra income and buy meat and vegetables, or should I buy these cheap calories? Of course, you can see where they go. And the final, last thing I'm going to say is there's an absence of knowledge. It's hidden hunger. It's hidden hunger. I mean, you don't know it. I don't know it. People don't know that they're malnourished even. And there's a slow and imperfect correlation between interventions. We show that about 50% of our kids get healthier and their grades go up. We ask the parents why the grades of their kids go up. They say, I don't know. I mean, because they don't know that taking that vitamin today leads to better health and nutrition tomorrow. People also just don't know. We asked the most educated person in every rural community, the principal of the school, what anemia was. 1 out of 20 principals knew. We then asked them to predict how many kids in their school had anemia. They said 3%. It was actually 33%. Out of 100 caregivers, moms and grandmas, 2 had ever had even 1 day of nutrition class. They just didn't know. And my favorite here is we asked 2,000 moms and grandmas, do human babies require micronutrients? Only 20% said yes. 80% said no, they don't need, they need calories. They then asked them, same women, do baby pigs require micronutrients? 80% said yes. So they know how to take care of pigs much better than they know how to take care of babies. I'm going to stop right there. The solutions are really, really hard to this problem. You got to train people. It's very hard to teach old dogs new tricks. You have to get them to spend money on themselves. There's a battle for the wallet. We have to do nutrition and interventions by the state. Well, the state has many demands on its resources. So I think that, it's a problem that's best solved by anticipating 20 years ahead of time. So I'm going to stop right there and just thank you for sharing these thoughts.
Okay, thank you again. It was great. we still have about 20 minutes left for discussion, and I'll make sure to leave plenty of time for the audience. But I obviously have lots of questions myself. So let's start in kind of where we stopped on the micronutrient issue, but more broadly the issue of the role of livestock and meat products. Because I think, in some circles and from some angles, livestock are part of the problem. In the climate change world, for example, now the statistics about how many greenhouse gases are coming from cow belches are ubiquitous. And there are sanitation issues. There are other things that Steve mentioned. But Marshall talked about sort of the extreme risky environment that really poor people in, and I know livestock are crucial there. And then, Scott, you're talking about the need to get micronutrients. And maybe we'll start with Marshall and work down, or you guys can sort it out. But I'm wondering, sort of, is livestock a big part of the solution? Is it a small part of the solution, or is it really part of the problem, or where do we differentiate where it is part of the solution?
I can defer to my taller and more senior colleagues here if necessary.
Well, I mean, I would argue for a nuanced view here. Clearly, children need nutrient-dense food, and animal-source food is the most nutrient-dense food that's available. On the other hand, if you look at raising poultry, or for example in Bangladesh, raising fish, is a much less environmentally demanding way to get high-quality nutrients. Cattle is at the far extreme in terms of environmental demands. So I do think that and also, I mean, wearing my adult medicine hat, I mean, the saturated fat from the amount of beef that high-income folks eat is actually not great nutrition. So I think that we shouldn't just say, well, wait a minute, the solution to the world is to go all vegan, or we have very much the problems that Scott identified. But I do think that there is a pathway that says we should consider what are the nutritional needs of communities, and then how can we get there sustainably. And I think that there are better alternatives than our current approaches.
I mean, I think it's the ultimate tension, right? I mean, is in climate change. If you look at our data, if you're eating 5 ounces of meat every day, you're less sick, your test scores are higher, you go further in school.
Is this any meat or?
Well, I think that it comes back to this, and it's, as we know, it's very, very hard to change taste and behavior, right? Is that Chinese love pork, right? And pork is almost as environmentally stressful as beef is, right? And but it's absolutely necessary. That's my project manager is a vegetarian. She's the one that's helped us push through a nutritious lunch program that basically commits to giving every Chinese kid 4 ounces of red meat every day. So, she has taken, and of course, that I think that it's put demands on world markets. Along with all the other consumption trends, forced up prices, and the very cheap calories that helped China get to this person is now being undermined in other countries, right? So it's climate change, non-climate change, it's second food security challenge and first food security challenge are in direct tension with one another, and besides the health consequences.
So just to add something there, I think in the countries I was talking about, so some of the poorest countries in the world in sub-Saharan Africa, livestock are also a really important part of households' financial strategies, right? Especially in the absence of more formal financial institutions. So if you don't have a savings account at a bank, you might instead invest in livestock, right? Because these are things that hopefully stick around, and in a bad year, you can either sell them or slaughter them, right? So in the absence of those other sort of financial tools, livestock played a really important role for these people. On the other hand, sort of the link to conflict, some of the pastoral areas in sub-Saharan Africa are also some of the most violent places in the world. So there's a good thing about livestock is this sort of buffer stock, this thing that stick around, but livestock are also lootable, right? They can be stolen. So if you go 100 miles north from some of my field sites in western Kenya, the Kenyan-Ugandan border is, I think, the most violent place on earth in terms of homicides. And these are all pastoralists and guys who steal a lot of cattle. So again, there's a tension. This is on a much more micro scale, but you know, at any rate, they're going to have an important role to play until we fix these sort of other financial institutions.
So bank accounts and vitamins might displace more greenhouse gases than anything else. One other question I had, just to link it to the Tomcat and Precourt focus, is this, it goes back to what Marshall was saying about paying double, investments paying double, sort of having these benefits beyond what we anticipate. And it seems to me that one of the exciting trends is with solar energy specifically, but maybe more portable, cheap, rural energy in general. And I was wondering if you could maybe spell out a little bit for the audience if and why you would see that as having benefits for the types of Nexi, not sure which one it is, that you guys talked about. So on the sanitation side, perhaps, or on just the rural productivity in general. And then, you know, I don't know on the intervention side that you were talking about, Scott, but have you guys thought much about the role of cheap energy?
If you look in rural Bangladesh right now, 60% of households are not on the grid, so they have no electricity. So if they're going to be doing any work at night, it's going to be with a kerosene lamp. So you're both going to get the adverse health impact of those incompletely combusted hydrocarbons, all the greenhouse blowback, and you can't read very well. In addition, if you think about all of the ways that clean energy can help to improve productivity more generally. Now, there are challenges to governance and challenges to getting disparate places on the grid. So I see the move towards distributed energy and low-cost energy as being one of these things that really can give us a double investment, a double return on investment. And that's both because of the economic productivity it can immediately give to households, as well as, you know, longer term, what those kinds of investments can mean in terms of child development.
But replug one of the projects that Roz mentioned, this project that uses solar power. So this is in a part of West Africa that's dry for most of the year. So it uses solar power in the dry part of the season where the sun's shining all the time to pump groundwater and irrigate high-value crops. So to me, these sorts of applications of these new energy technologies seem hugely promising, especially when we've had a really hard time improving the productivity of sort of the staple crops in sub-Saharan Africa. So sort of to the extent that these sorts of technologies will allow households to be able to grow and sell higher value commodities, I think this could have a huge boost for food security.
But you have to see the other side. So let's go, I mean, and I think that it's good planning, right? Let's go electrify all of Bangladesh and all of India like they have in China, right? So 99.8% of Chinese households are now electrified. What are they doing? They're plugging into a grid that's run by coal-fired power plants, right? That in a middle-income country, they aren't turning on, you know, any of the scrubbers, and it's causing tremendous pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So heading it off with alternative energy, you know, once the grid's in, it's really hard to replace it, right? So.
Yeah, I think the other kind of caveat there is that, like in India where I just was, it's really lack of energy that's preventing the groundwater from being depleted even further, and it would be the same issue in probably North China as well. But overall, I think, you know, for spending an hour talking about war and hunger and untreated sewage, I'm pretty optimistic here. It seems like the trends are in many cases positive, and the understanding is really, I think, driving some new approaches that are probably going to help, in my view, make a dent in that kind of stubborn 800 million number that Roz talked about. So I'm going to open up here for the audience, hoping that you guys were stimulated enough and brave enough to start asking questions. Right here in the front. We have mics that are going to come to you.
And identify you.
There you go.
When you mentioned pumping the water in Africa to grow crops that are going to generate money, Are we talking about cash crops that are going to be exported or nutritionally valuable food that's going to feed the population?
Yeah, great question. So in this setting, it was crops that are being used both for home consumption. There's almost all vegetable crops, carrots, onions, things like this. So high nutritional value vegetable crops that are being eaten in the household, and then the surplus is sold in the market. So it has this sort of double whammy of sort of directly improving home nutrition and then also generating cash that they can spend on sort of whatever else.
Any students? You got a student here? Yeah. Go ahead. And if you want to take a second to identify yourself at the beginning, that'll help the panelists.
Hi, yeah, my name is Vijay. I'm finishing up my PhD in materials science and engineering. And the question is primarily directed towards Scott. You made an interesting comment that said we're victims of the Green Revolution in that we're just providing a lot of empty calories for people in rural communities. And I was wondering if you had sort of any thoughts on strategies perhaps where we can leverage those crop resources to give higher order nutrients to people in these communities.
Yeah, so I mean, we're really good at producing cereals from the Green Revolution, and they aren't empty calories in poor countries. I mean, they're key. Right? You want to produce those calories, right? The cereals, the lentils. In poor countries, that gives you protein and calories that are going to, get you up to $5,000 per year, right? They become empty calories, when you're at 3,000 calories already per day, and now you need, all the micronutrients to go with it. So the question is can we take these and engineer these crops to put to fortify them with micronutrients as they're grown in the ground? There's some very interesting experiments and lots of work going on in the international community on how to do that. To date, it hasn't been really successful. Oftentimes, it involves sort of transforming the color or the taste, and so people like their rice the way the way mom grew it, and so you engineer it to have another flavor because you have iron in it or you have something else in it. It's hard to do. Also, there's lots of problems with pushing transgenic varieties, both political and probably scientific problems. So that's one thing. The other hand is, can you go fortify them? Like we fortify, my son this morning had Cheerios, right? I mean, absolutely nutritionless Cheerios, but happens to be fortified with 27 micronutrients, right? And that's certainly a great strategy to do it. But the problem is in middle and poor countries is that people produce their own crops and eat their own crops, and that it doesn't go through the mills that then fortifies it and then comes back to them. So I think that we need to think out of the box with these things, and I think that there's lots of scope in these areas.
And Scott, is it fair to say that rice-based cultures are rice is especially poor in micronutrients and proteins relative to most other staples around the world? Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, but almost no of the staples has the micronutrients you need. I mean, you need fruits, vegetables, meat.
Sure.
Right.
Go over here.
Just on the meat, I was just curious about it. Like, we have a population of vegans who seem to be perfectly healthy, and it's a fact that you don't need meat to be healthy, but you need fruits, you need other things than just rice. So why don't look at meat? Why not focus on how do we give them some apples or bananas or whatever they have to? That's the local vegetables or fruit that they can have in those areas. And to that question, when you're looking at these people who are only producing rice, are there any help or any programs that can give them this risk aversion towards trying out new things in place?
There's a couple questions here. I'll answer the first one. So the problem is if you're undernourished, if you're anemic, for example, it's very, very hard to absorb non-Heme, that means vegetable-based irons and micronutrients. Once you're well nourished, your body, I mean, it has a lot to do with your intestines and the way that you extract micronutrients out of the foods that come through that Rodney Dangerfield small intestine. And so it's almost impossible to feed non-meat sources of food to an anemic person and to get them out of, to basically solve their anemia. Is meats, Heme sources of iron. And it can be many different types of meat. It can be fish, it can be poultry, it doesn't have to be beef, so it can be all those. And the other thing is as a vegan, you're eating the Cheerios that my son ate this morning, and they're all fortified too. So it's much easier to be, or your wheat, all your wheat flour, you make a pastry, you know, at home, or make a loaf of bread, buy any bread from the grocery store here, it's all fortified with iron. So you're getting those sources as a vegan in a developed country from a lot of different sources.
So we have time for 2 or 3 questions. I believe that the folks online, there's about 216 people, I'm told, watching online. And do they have a question, or?
So I'm Mark Golden, I work for Precourt Institute. This is not my question, we'll see how you handle it. From Twitter, Kellen Klein asks,
It's a short one.
between food, water, and energy, which will be the choke point that forces us towards systems change? Food, water, or energy? That's for the whole panel.
The choke point.
I'm
Well,
going to
there's a
defer to
premise
Marshall.
there.
Defer to Marshall too. Or David, let's defer
Well,
to
we can
David.
break the tie here. We got 4 people, so let's just vote, I guess.
My response would be it depends on where you are. In California, it looks like water. Might be water. You know, sub-Saharan Africa, it's maybe food or some combination of water and food.
My answer would be food, only because I think water with enough energy isn't so scarce, and I think food depends on land, which we're not making more of, as was said once. But yes, all 3 are important issues. Anything from this side of the room? I feel like I've neglected you with the podium here. Here you go. There's a lady right here. Just wait for the mic. It's coming right there.
We've talked a lot about meat, particularly red meat, but what strikes me is that over time, the method of production of ranching has changed substantially, so that in many of the countries that you're talking about, low income that turned into middle income, what you used to have is that a lot of small farmers, a lot of small ranchers, and that they ate their meat, and that they ate their fruits and vegetables. But now it's no longer feasible to be small. You need to get scale. And as you get to scale, you also have changed the way in which you're feeding your cattle. And so it's no longer grass-fed. It becomes soy-fed. And that all has an impact on land and what you are able to grow and what your yield is, and changes the whole social dynamics, both of the country and the industry. And so it becomes a much more complicated picture, I think, in part, than just the sort of, and so then we perhaps have been just discussing, because it's all very circular, and the more technology we apply, the more impact it has on everything and changing all of the dynamics.
Yeah, all I can say is if you look at the world in a graph, and it's income per capita here along this way, and so rich countries are here and poor countries, and here is the share of people in agriculture, and so 100%, everybody's up here, and here we're in the U.S. we're 1%, 2%, right? This curve is remarkable. It's called the iron law of economic development, and it goes like that, and it's all rich countries in the world, less than 10% of people are in agriculture. Mostly it's under 5%. And poor countries, and so if you unless we can think of a completely different way to develop, we're going to lose all those small farms, and we're going to, everybody's going to move to the city, and or everybody's going to move work in the factories. That's how you get income per capita rises. So I don't know how we. I mean, we do need to think about that, but I think that it's going to be inevitable. So it's thinking about how to manage a transformation, not how to stop it. So it's
and I also think this is within the context of how do we feed 10 billion people by 2050. So I think you're right that historically we raised animals and we raised crops much less intensively, but we also weren't feeding a population of 10 billion.
Let's give the last question to that, I think, student back there. There's a mic right there.
So one thing that sort of struck me was, we're talking about whether or not to eat animals, but as a mother of a toddler, I think a lot about this because I'm concerned about his iron and zinc levels all the time. And I keep saying, if only I could get him to eat liver and egg yolks and mollusks because they're so high in iron and zinc, and the heme absorption is great. Just combine that with a little vitamin C, and he'll be good. So it's not just the type of animal and the types of resources that cattle take, which is obviously a huge consideration, but eating the whole animal, eating more organ meats and things like that. And I'm wondering if there's very much receptivity in these countries to that, if they are eating whole animals, and whether that's able to improve things, or even in this country whether there's room for that, or eating other parts of the animals that we normally discard.
Well, I know Marshall was raised on chicken liver, so.
I can confirm that my 2 toddlers won't eat any part of an animal, even the normal part, so it's a hard problem.
Well, I can say in Bangladesh that it can be really hard to change food habits. Food habits are really deeply culturally ingrained. And so, wait a minute, I ate rice, why should we have it? And maybe a little bit of green vegetables, that's enough. If given small fish, they'll certainly eat the whole small fish. And in that context, being able to add fish and poultry to the diet is somewhat attractive, but those families are competing with what they can get in the market for that too, and whether that's seen as a greater benefit to the family rather than investing. I mean, I would say it's not just simply figuring out maybe what's optimal in that situation, but how do you have a constructive dialogue with the folks who are actually engaged in making those decisions? And I would say decades of research in those communities by nutritionists this is really hard.
Okay, I'm going to have to close it out there. This is going to end the day for the folks online because we aren't videotaping the rest. So thank you for joining us. Those are online. The rest of you, we're going to close this session. There's a short break. There's a series of student breakouts, which year after year get voted the highlight of the event. So we tried to set the bar high, but they'll probably exceed it. So I encourage you to go to that. And then we're coming back here after that. You guys all have the program, so you see that for the keynote by Secretary Ross. So let me thank again the speakers, and please join me as we close out.